one of my staff read an article that this woman had about 2,000 plus cookbooks and had the largest collection according to Guinness. And they came to me and they said, "Oh, Lisa, you'll leave her in the dust. We got to get on this. How would you feel if we went to Guinness?" And I was like, okay. It took 3 years to catalog the collection formally. I hired someone with a library degree, and she had also worked in a bookstore, and she sat in my library. I had already organized it, but she put it on the computer, and we had to follow very strictly the rules of Guinness. And they are a lot of rules. So long story, it took us about 9 months to submit all the forms. We had a video every shelf. We had to list every book, which was on the computer, which is why I did that. So I know every book that's in my collection. When all was said and done, it was just over 4,200. It takes Guinness 3 years to respond. We finally got notification that I had been awarded the largest cookbook collection in the world.
Welcome to Kochleffel, a podcast series about the remarkable contribution of Jewish women to the world of food. In almost every aspect of our food system, way out of proportion to our numbers in the world, Jewish women rise professionally and personally in virtually every aspect of food. These women are wonderful. Chefs, academics, editors and writers, corporate strategists, restaurant owners, policy wonks, media figures, and more. And that's what a Kochleffel is. In German, a Kochleffel is simply a soup ladle, but in Yiddish, that wonderful, ironic, juicy language, a Kochleffel is someone who stirs things up, makes things happen, and that's what these women in our midst do. They make good things happen. When we first began to work on Kochleffel, doing a podcast series on Jewish women in food was not controversial. Clearly, in today's moment, everything having to do with Jews or Israel is complex. But as fraught as this time is, we need to come together and celebrate the good that we do, the joyful things we do as individuals and as a world community. In a way, we believe that it is more important than ever to shine a light on remarkable Jewish women in food. Our guest today is Lisa Ekus. Lisa is the founder of the Ekus Group, a literary agency specializing in representing a world of culinary talent. She has over 40 years of experience representing food personalities, writers, cookbooks, restaurants, and food products. The agency she founded represents more than 350 authors and works with numerous leading publishers worldwide. She is a sought-after expert and agent, and her media training, which was featured on NPR's All Things Considered, helps culinary professionals improve their media presentation, their video and interviewing skills. She travels globally to present seminars, workshops, and panels, and she has hosted everyone from Julia Child to Emeril Lagasse in her kitchen and at her table. Lisa sees food as a common denominator that brings family and friends together, and she sits down for dinner as often as possible with her family, friends, and clients. And last but not least, she is also the proud owner of more than 7,000 cookbooks. The Guinness Book of World Records just awarded Lisa the honor of holding the largest personal cookbook collection in the world, a Kochleffel of the first order. Let's have a listen. We're talking now to Lisa Ekus, one of the clear beacons in the world of food publishing, of cookbooks, and of everything having to do with making people who write cookbooks and people who make food into the titanic figures that they are today. And so let's just start. Tell me about how you grew up.
Okay.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Westchester County, New York, in Tarrytown, where the legend of Sleepy Hollow rules. And I lived there until I went off to college. I grew up in what I would say traditional secular home. We did belong to a synagogue, but we were Reformed. I would say the guiding principle of being Jewish were the major holidays, and they absolutely circulated around food and the recipes. My mother, for most of my life, was the cook. In the later years, my dad got very involved, but she really brought to the family and to the table the long-standing recipes. In fact, her brisket recipe was published by the New York Daily News decades ago, and I still make it. I make it for every holiday, and every time I try to make something different from a different chef or author, no, make Grandma's brisket. And she was a very good cook. I remember that we ate what I will call normally, except for the holidays. And then the traditional family recipes came out and were made. Her rugula was another recipe that she would do from scratch. And the neighbor had a grandmother that would come in twice a year and do blintzas from scratch. I grew up understanding traditional food and really loving it. And it was special. And it was special for the holidays.
Were your parents first-generation Americans, second-generation Americans?
My grandparents were all born in America, in the U.S. Their parents were born in Eastern Europe. We are Ashkenazi Jews.
What I consider to be the American Jewish tradition of that everybody, the observances, the weekly observances start to go down a generation. Jewish education sorts to go down another generation, but the food and the holidays seem to sustain us.
They're everlasting, or at least I hope so, and I've passed the food traditions down to both my daughters. We would go to temple on the high holy days. We did not go every week. Occasionally we did, but we were very much part of the Jewish community. We were in the minority where we were in terms of population, but we were also had a lot of Jewish friends and a lot of non-Jewish friends.
And so if somebody had asked you back in those days how important being Jewish or of Jewish heritage was to you, what would you have said?
Enormously important. I really embraced not the Orthodox side of the religion, but being Jewish was something I was very, and still am, very proud of. It is important to me. My children were raised what I will call gently Jewish. And I think of it as a religion, as a cultural choice, as a choice of unity. I spent a lot of time in Israel when I was a teenager and in college, and that also reinforced my commitment to being Jewish and what that means.
Interesting. And then let me ask you, then you went off on your career, and how did you find your way into publishing and food publishing and all of that? How did that happen?
I was always a huge reader. I went to Barnard College in Manhattan, and I knew I wanted to do something with books in the publishing world. And I did an internship in my junior year with a woman who happened to be Jewish.
They're out there.
She was such a mentor and leader for me. And there's a kind of end story to this of going full circle. I did a volunteer internship, and then she hired me to stay on. And she was a young entrepreneur raising 3 young Jewish children. She was more religious than my family was, and I learned quite a bit from her. And she got me so enamored of the publishing world, and I learned so much from her, not only about publishing, but about starting my own business and what it's like to have it all, meaning not easy have it all, but have a family, have kids and raise them, have a career. And when I graduated from college, my first job was with Random House, and I was in publicity. So I started in book PR, and the first week I went in there, we launched Bill Styron's Sophie's Choice, James Michener's new book, and Kurt Vonnegut's new book, I had died and gone to heaven.
Totally.
It was about 3 years before I started going into culinary. And I worked there, and then I went to Wall Street for a year because one of my book clients hired me to manage. He was a money manager to run his office. So I learned finance, hated it, went back to publishing, went to Crown. And when I was at Crown is when I started to really work with a couple of cookbooks. And one of my first ones was Jennifer Harvey Lang, who was married to George Lang, who ran Café des Artistes. And I worked on her book and a couple of others, and all of a sudden I was an expert in food. I mean, I wasn't. I knew the media, and I paid attention. And then I realized how, one, it was growing and changing, and there were food magazines really hitting their stride, but the publishers weren't really paying much attention yet. And I connected with a fabulous editor at Crown named Knock Waxman, who went on to run Kitchen Arts and Letters, another Jewish man who took me under his wing, mentored me. I ended up doing the publicity, the opening publicity for Kitchen Arts and Letters when it started 40 plus years ago. Everything comes full circle. And Jean Nagar of the Jean Nagar Agency was the woman who gave me my very first entree into publishing. And now my daughter, Sally, who has taken over my business, is working with her agency, whose her daughter took over. So we had two parallel, two-generation businesses, all Jewish, and we're working together. It's the most amazing loop to both close and go forward.
That's amazing. Wow. And
it is. I also want to tell you one more thing, because I mentioned, because of food being the guiding issue here and love of food, when I spent time in Israel when I was in college, I was on a kibbutz. And I went to learn Hebrew, but we really were put to work. And I was put to work in the kitchen of this kibbutz. And we made 3 meals a day for 124 people, kosher. I chose a more religious kibbutz to learn, because I did not grow up kosher. My grandmother kept kosher, but my mother did not. And I wanted to learn more. So the joke, because I cook large quantities of food, is that I cook for the whole kibbutz in volume and quantity. And it's become a big joke in my family about me.
because you still cook in quantity for...
Oh, yes. And I'm always entertaining. I just had 19 for Passover.
Yeah, was busy here too, I have to say.
Yes.
And
it's
think
wonderful.
That part of it, yeah, it's wonderful. This is something I've been thinking about. In Italian they call it abbondanza. I don't know what we call it in Yiddish, but this whole idea of many people and more food and more people, that is to me the essence of how I live. Do you think that's a Jewish thing?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. It was in my family, and it is in my family now. I would imagine Italian families would say the same thing. For my growing up years, and particularly my teenage years, we were the gathering place. That's where all the good food was. That's where the fun was. That's where the parties were. My dad was known on Sunday mornings to get in the car and drive the 40 minutes to Zabar's, load up, come back, and we'd have brunch. And all my high school girlfriends would come. Food was and is the common denominator. I think it's what brings people together, Jewish or not. You can solve a lot of things over the table with good food. I entertain many times a week, and it's both how I live, what I saw, what I echoed and bringing forward into my life. And my kids do too. They're great. They're both grown-up young women, and they entertain constantly, and they have all my recipes.
Wow. That's just wonderful. And Did you ever think of doing anything other than food once you started to rock and roll on your own as a literary entrepreneur?
The only time I thought about doing something was the year that I was brought down to Wall Street, and I thought publishing wasn't so much away from food as it was publishing, which doesn't pay and didn't pay well. Going into finance was a way to make a lot more money, and I was so disinterested in it that I realized my passion was books and then eventually food. One year I worked on 3 cookbooks, the next year it was like 9, and then it kept growing, and eventually it was almost all culinary. We do a little bit of lifestyle PR campaigns, book campaigns. That actually grew into literary agenting, but all in the culinary world, working with cookbook writers, food writers, chefs, restaurateurs. Over the years, I worked with a lot of major companies, both small, homegrown food companies and the big ones, the really big ones. Every single job was a learning opportunity.
You are known also for your incredible cookbook collection. You have many thousand. Tell us about that. How did that happen?
I'm what I call a book addict hoarder. I think there's a great addiction to have. Because of working on so many cookbooks, I obviously kept them. I organized them. I would have them signed. I had so many of my clients and authors always to dinner. I also ran a media training program, so chefs would come in and I'd always have their cookbooks. All of a sudden, I realized that I had quite the collection, and I started formally organizing it. And it's probably about 7 years now. One of my staff read an article that this woman had about 2,000 plus cookbooks and had the largest collection according to Guinness. And they came to me and they said, "Oh, Lisa, you'll leave her in the dust. We got to get on this. How would you feel if we went to Guinness?" And I was like, okay. It took 3 years to catalog the collection formally. I hired someone with a library degree, and she had also worked in a bookstore, and she sat in my library. I had already organized it, but she put it on the computer. Everything is author, topic, title, categorized by subject. It might be Jewish, single subject, vegetarian, reference, restaurant. So everything has its place, and in those sections they're also alphabetized. So we kept going, and we had to follow very strictly the rules of Guinness. And they are a lot of rules. So long story, it took us about 9 months to submit all the forms. We had a video every shelf. We had to list every book, which was on the computer, which is why I did that. So I know every book that's in my collection. When all was said and done, it was just over 4,200. And
you definitely beat that other woman.
Pandemic. Wait, it gets better. So the pandemic hits. It takes Guinness 3 years to respond through the pandemic. And we're in 24, so in July of 22, we finally got notification that I had been awarded the largest cookbook collection in the world with 4,200 and change, and I have a nice little paper certificate. However, it took 3 years, so I have almost 3,000 more cookbooks by that time. And almost all of them are listed in the collection. I have about 5 cartons that are waiting to be inputted because I buy, I trade, people give me, I go to thrift stores, I buy cartons of books at auction. If I see something that interests me, people often will say, "Why do you want this book? What draws you to this?" It can be anything. It can be an unusual cuisine. It can be, I knew the author or the author's family, so I want to have that book. I love the books that are of a time and a place and a culture that I can learn from. And I have worked on thousands of cookbooks between the PR campaigns and the literary representation. So I can open a book, know if a recipe works, understand why this book is in the world. Sometimes it may not be a very good reason, and sometimes it's, to me, priceless for what it shares, for the story of who wrote it, for the recipes that get passed down. And we actually, in the agency, ended up working with many Jewish cookbook writers over the years and developed a specialty with the numerous Jewish publications that would promote them. So my Jewish section is fairly large, and I know exactly which books to go to for which recipes, and it's such a gift.
And we'll be back with Lisa Ekus in just a moment. And we are back with Lisa Ekus. It's an incredible story. And looking back on all of these Jewish cookbook writers and Jewish chefs, if I were to ask you to generalize about them, could you? Who they are, why they write, what draws them to the topic?
I think it's continuity and cultivation of the culture. It's being able to save and pass forward these traditions, the food, the ingredients, the way food is made. So people may not make blinis anymore, or they make blinis, but are they going to make blintzas? Are they going to make... In each culture, if you look at, say, chicken soup, or you look at pancakes, every culture has a recipe that ties in. Because of our history and going all over the world, the adaptation of how things are made and how they change and evolve is what's being shared and saved. So it might be Latin American recipes that have a base in Jewish ingredients, or it gets shifted because you don't have X, but you have Y, and that's what you use. It's almost like the passing forward of the food gene, of the kinds of foods are what ties us together when we drifted. Families aren't in the same neighborhoods. They're not even in the same state a lot of times. So these Jewish cookbooks gathered many different reflections and manifestations of, I don't know if I was going to say original recipes. Is there original recipes? But how things are made and the stories. I'm hugely interested in culture and stories because that to me is what brings permanence. The ingredients you use can shift a little bit, but the stories have the link. That's what's woven together and woven forward. And even if someone is not religious, the tradition of a foodstuff can tie in memories, can tie in family. And that's what I really love.
I was thinking today that because Jews as a people have not had a geographic center, most cultures, most tribes have a geographic center that stays. The one thing they could always carry with them was their palate and their palate memory. And that became the portable, forever connection.
It was the link.
Yeah.
It was recipes weren't written down for a long time. Recipes in a written form are very new, relatively speaking. And so it was in the telling, in the doing, in the teaching that so many of these recipes went forward. Now, if I want to make rugala, I can go find, I don't know, 100 plus recipes, but it's still different in watching my mother spread the cream cheese. Of what did she choose? Why did she choose raisins and nuts over cinnamon, or what, why and what? So that's also how people start to narrow down their preferences because they follow what their grandmothers did. My grandmother made a meatloaf that she put hard-boiled eggs in. I didn't know that until I went to visit her. She spent a decade in Israel in the middle of her life just because. And she made this meatloaf. I'm like, what is this? My mother never made this. You didn't teach this to Mom. And that was something she carried forward.
She had seen it in Israel, or she had it in her life. That was her mother's recipe with the hard-boiled eggs? And
yes, it was, I guess, my great-grandmother's recipe.
Somebody was just telling me a few weeks ago how when their grandmother made matzo balls, she put in the middle of every matzo ball a little piece of chopped liver. And I was like, God, that's weird. Now, why do I think that's weird? It is weird.
That is weird.
It is weird. But the idea, and that's how they make it, because that's how their mother made it. And that's how their grandmother made it. And does it matter beyond that? Not really.
Have you ever heard that it's a joke story that you have to cut off part of the brisket? And it goes generation to generation. And it turns out you don't. It's that they didn't have a pan big enough for the full flat of the brisket. So they cut off part of it. Like, we don't always know when or why a decision is made about making a change. Now, with the huge rise in people who are vegetarian or vegan, you're not going to have chopped liver in the middle of a piece of a matzo ball unless you make an exception because that's your tradition. For my Passover recently, oh my goodness, I had people who were vegetarian. I had people who were gluten-free. I had people who couldn't eat chicken eggs. I couldn't use schmaltz in the matzo ball because I had chicken, which I had a vegetarian. So I actually made 3 versions of matzo balls, and some of that will go forward to my kids because they can then include more people who may have more dietary specifications. It's a little nuts, but I actually respect people who have preferences in what they eat or allergies. And that also influences what we cook and how we cook it and for whom.
Sure. Sometimes I feel like when I have all these different people with all their different food issues, that it's like problem solving when 3 unknowns. And I like it. What could I possibly make other than Jell-O that will satisfy everybody?
Right. I made a lot of vegetarian vegetable dishes that set out to be vegetarian, ended up being vegan because they were just so good with coconut milk, and it fit who was coming and the variety of people. And I think that's something that's changed, that yes, there's certain, like we will always have celery and hard-boiled eggs and we'll have brisket, but I also had other foods so I could be more inclusive. And that's how traditions slowly changed too.
Yeah, traditions are mutable. Mm-hmm. I had a wonderful experience a few years ago. My mother was a terrible cook, but the only thing she really made that I think of as her recipe is a kiss tort. She always called it a kiss tort. It was a meringue that she would make on Passover and would bring to my grandmother's house, and we filled it with whipped cream and strawberries. And there was always a big to-do in my household because some days it would be too gooey, some days it would be too brittle. Anyhow, she never quite figured out the science of meringue. But anyhow, it was my mother's kiss tort. It was a thing to do. And then,
the weather. The answer is the weather.
Right. And it's much easier, I have to say, with a convection stove. And then a few years ago, I was in Tel Aviv with a friend of mine who's a well-known Israeli chef. And he said, I have to take you to this Iraqi bakery in Tel Aviv. You have to come. It's just incredible. They were bakers in Iraq for however many generations, and they're here now, and his food is incredible. So I go with him to this little hole-in-the-wall Iraqi bakery, and the baker says to me as I'm leaving, you have to try, he's a French-speaking Israeli, you have to try my pièce de résistance. And I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. And he gives me this thing to taste, and it is my mother's kiss tort. And I said, oh my God, I know this. He said, yes, it's my baiser, which means kiss in French. And I thought, how wonderful this is. I come all the way to Israel. He comes all the way from Iraq. The thing that he's making, I have no idea why my mother's kiss tort was called a kiss tort. He had no idea why it was called a baiser, but there it was. It was a watershed moment for me in thinking about the way food travels, and food also always stays the same. That's just fascinating. You should do a cookbook.
That's a great story. We taste something and it brings us back to our childhood homes or our grandmothers or our grandfathers, and it's like you've never missed a beat because that taste memory transcends decades or centuries. I love that story. It really encapsulates how tradition travels. The other thing that I've noticed over the course of almost 50 years in food, career-wise, is when there is conflict, when there is war, conflict, upheaval, that's when a lot of new ingredients and recipes travel because people move. And when they move, they bring what's nearest and dearest to them wherever they go. And as you said, it's taste. For me, it's memory and taste. And so that's why we see this huge embracing and understanding of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ingredients and flavors. And we watch how that happens and how newspapers, magazines will essentially get on the bandwagon, but it's the people, the chefs, who first give us our tastes. And then we want to know, where is that from? How did it get here? Who is making it? How does it relate and intersect with what I know? And the availability of so much now. The difference in a couple of decades of what we can buy and use in our kitchen is astronomical. And that's just so exciting. I had a neighbor call me about 3 weeks ago and say, we're making a recipe and we need za'atar. Do you have any za'atar? I said, of course I do. That would have never happened before.
It's true. And the exoticism the availability has increased. The exoticism has gone down. I mean, it's funny. Every once in a while I come across...
It's been more normalized. But I think it's exciting.
I do too. I see a lot of men with Ottolenghi cook.
I was just gonna bring him up. I had a new recipe at a family Seder from him that was essentially spicy, tomato-based spicy fish balls. So if you don't like gefilte fish, that's perfect. I loved it so much that I'm going to integrate it into my regular repertoire, not just on Passover, because I thought it was so great. And the gefilte book, which I also really love, has a recipe for what I call gefilte fish loaf. So if you don't want the days and all the work to make gefilte fish, and some people do because it's really important to have the jellied balls in a certain way, I found that many of the family and friends, they didn't eat enough to make it worth the effort. But this book, Gefilte, has a loaf recipe for ground fish with spices that completely echoes gefilte fish, takes less than 10 minutes to put together, and is a home run with everybody. But it's an evolution of the flavors and the taste.
I think I need that recipe. I made gefilte fish like twice, and then I said to myself, no, it is not worth it to me.
Yeah.
Screw that.
And it's really fish quenelles. It's just
fish quenelles with matzo meal in them. I think I will never do that again.
Try that recipe because it is hands down a go-to.
And what book is it in?
And I will give you the author's name in a moment. I'm just blanking at the moment, but it has lovely recipes in it. In fact, even though homemade horseradish is very easy, it gives you just the proportions for the vinegar to pour over. I actually go in my garden and dig my horseradish, so that's another thing that's on my Passover table every year. There are people who come just for the horseradish. Okay. Oh, it's Gefilte Manifesto, and it's Jeffrey Yaskowitz and Liz Alpern, based out of New York.
Yeah.
Gefilte Manifesto.
Yeah. I remember hearing about this book.
So I highly recommend it. But it's a couple years old, but it's not like an old traditional Jewish book. If I have questions, I always go to Joe Nathan. I often will look at several recipes from different people I respect and then pull out my mother's. Most of the recipes from my mother and often grandmothers, if the grandmothers even wrote them down, which is very iffy, but they're little index cards and they have not many measurements and no methodology. So we really had to figure this out in the last 30, 40 years, which is when you see the proliferation of the Jewish cookbooks.
I know that when my oldest daughter got married, her husband is from Russia, and his mother is a great cook. She's a great cook. And of course, like all good Russians, she now lives in Palo Alto. But we did a joint cookbook that we called the Mothers-in-Law Cookbook, and all of our best recipes to our children, and got it all printed up and gave it to everybody as the gift at the wedding for people to take home. And her two daughters had to sit on her elbow as she did everything and measure out every pinch because it had never occurred to her to have a recipe. She is a great cook. It's a really fun cookbook.
You do it by feel.
People ask me, like, how big should the brisket be? And I'm like, I don't know. Big. More than 3 pounds. I can tell you that. You put this in.
What's a yield? What's a yield? Till you make enough and there's got to be leftovers. Right. Okay, so I have a question for you. Did you ever have FHB in your family? You know what FHB is?
No.
We thought it was a Jewish thing. I don't know.
Family hold back.
That's it.
Yes.
That's exactly right. More people would show up, and you want to make sure you always fed everybody. So it would be like FHB with a little wink, and family takes less, so all the guests and friends can take more.
Why do you think that there are so many Jewish women in food? Not just in cooking, but in food broadly.
I think food is so inherent to the Jewish family and Jewish culture. Women are the ones who traditionally, not always, but who traditionally do the cooking. I wouldn't want to exclude other cultures. You could say the same thing again around maybe Italian, because the mamas cooked, for sure. But there's something about opening one's home, always making people feel welcome. It's very Jewish. It's a basic tenet. One of the things, I know we're just in Passover season now, but I always, for Passover for sure, but even any holiday, Jewish or not, make sure that anybody who has nowhere to go is invited to my table. So there are always people who, for whatever reason, they might be recently widowed or divorced, or their family isn't celebrating, whatever it is, I gather people to the table. And it's a little trite, but food is love. Food is inclusion. The way Jews think about taking care of each other, taking care of their family, welcoming strangers, being loving, always having a place. It's a way to give back, to offer. And I can't say more Jews do it than any other people. I don't know that, but it is certainly a thread that moves all through Jewish families that I know. And it really does lead with the women. And I'm curious, will this continue? Because now women aren't staying home. They're not making the food all day and the many dishes. Will this continue? I hope it does. I see it with my daughters for sure, how they entertain, who is invited into their home, the repetition of meals and individual dishes that they grew up with and love. I think it's just part of our culture. It's part of our caring.
It's part of Tikkun Olam, repair the world, I think.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's taken care of. Yes. And we all have to eat. We all know there's so much hunger and famine in the world. I just want to gather these people and feed them. And we can't take care of everyone, but we can take care of those around us and make a very concentrated effort. And that's how I live. That's the value system that I pass on, not only to my children, but to my friends, to the people who come in. And it's just part of how I define myself. We can be a little bit frivolous and say, oh, she's always entertaining. But what I'm doing is feeding and sharing. And it's the people. The food is always good, but it doesn't even have to be. It's the people, the conversations, and the connections. And I think that's something else that Jewish women are very good at doing, is making connections that will make a difference, that will lead other places into better things happening in the world.
That's just beautiful. I think we should end it there. I think that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. You are for sure a Kochleffel of the first order.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. I'm very honored to be included, and I wish my parents were alive. They would be so happy to know about your project and that you chose to have me on the podcast. And
thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to Kochleffel, Jewish Women in Food, brought to you by The Food Voice. Executive producer and host Louisa Kasdan. Audio director and composer Michael Moss. Recorded at Soundscape Productions in Dedham, Massachusetts. We thank Heritage Radio Network and the combined Jewish philanthropies of Greater Boston for their generous support.